This is the Hanford Reach, a 51-mile stretch of the Columbia River that runs through the middle of the Hanford Nuclear Reservation in southeast Washington state. It is the largest spawning ground for the Chinook salmon in the country, and they're spawning right now. Efforts are underway to make it a federally protected wilderness area. But there are a few problems to be dealt with first. Hanford, located in southeastern Washington state, produced thousands of pounds of plutonium for America's nuclear arsenal, including the plutonium that was used in the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. For 30 miles, the Columbia runs through the middle of the Hanford Reservation. The last of the 9 reactors closed down in 1989, but there are some indications radiation levels may be increasing. 444 billion gallons of radioactive waste were dumped here over a 50-year period. Norm Buskey first sailed down this stretch in 1983, asked by the Yakima Indians to help expose radiation levels to the world. He enlisted the help of Greenpeace and again took samples along the riverbanks.
See, in the first years we'd be out putting inflatables up now and looking up and to see how long we had before the helicopters showed up. The Department of Energy wanted to put the nation's first high-level waste repository almost directly under Purex, which was the only facility in the country that could take the waste and manufacture it into bombs. So that's what got us into it. They were not looking at what you could look at. And the Columbia River, what we called it, was the public's window on Hanford.
So we began our voyage down the river in a pontoon boat. Buskey discussed where we should take samples with John Broder, a geophysicist.
Okay, I'll change.
We can stop here at these areas.
Right.
This is Casey Rood. Once in charge of cleaning up the tank farms at Hanford, he blew the whistle on the Department of Energy's efforts to cover up the dangers.
Well, this is the B reactor coming up, which is the very
This was the reactor that
the
produced
reactor
plutonium used in the Nagasaki
was the
bomb.
inception of
The A reactor in Oak Ridge produced uranium for the bomb on Hiroshima.
Well, B reactor they're making into a museum, which I guess you have to have a museum to reflect back on. The DOE doesn't want to talk about the contamination that's all around the reactors. What they want to do is they want to go through and they want to kind of clean up the surface of the soil, but they don't want to deal with the stuff that's down deep that's leaching into the Columbia River.
What I want to show you here is first of all, is an aerial survey that was done in 1988, showing the gamma radiation. And we have some hot spots here at the B complex, the B reactor complex. Here we show basically the strontium-90 groundwater contamination plume. I think this is from the 1997 groundwater monitoring report. But you see the plume here is in this region. It's from the releases to the subsurface at the reactor building itself.
These were called once-through reactors, and what they did not, the only product from them was plutonium. To create the plutonium in the reactors, you have a huge amount of heat. And so the reason they set this up on the Columbia River was there's a lot of water and you heat the river up. On these old reactors, everything that was before N reactor was called a once-through reactor. That meant you just ran it past the fuel rods. They took it out, put it in tanks that were sitting over basically gravel, and then piped it out into the river. That made the Columbia River the most radioactive river in the world for a while.
This is the K area of the Hanford site, and here's where there are spent fuel pools containing several million curies of old nuclear reactor fuel, mostly from N reactor, I believe, that never got processed. And at this point, these spent fuel pools, which are about 300 yards or so from the river, are in decrepit shape and are threatening the river.
This is the N reactor, the last reactor built. It opened in 1963 and closed in 1989. It was the blueprint for the graphite reactor built in Chernobyl.
Not a surprise so much that we're getting a measurable background in terms of cesium, cobalt. I mean, those are the things that we're detecting right now. Cesium 137, cobalt 60, and I haven't just taken a look at the individual peaks, which is really difficult in this sunlight, but I can see the individual gamma ray peaks, gamma ray photon peaks here that tell us that there's cesium and cobalt here.
In 1990, most of the production facilities had been shut down. N-reactor was on warm standby. And actually Hanford had gotten into its cleanup mode. Rather than producing plutonium to basically keep the whole thing running, what they were into was cleanup to keep it running. But they had not caught on to end springs yet, and they had actually a real problem with strontium-90 becoming so high in the river that it was going to make it so you couldn't drink the water from the strontium-90, and they would not listen. What I did was I had kept the mulberries, and I made mulberry jam, which I brought along. And we sent a bottle to the governor and to the Secretary of Energy, along with, you know, a notice and stuff, and then we called them beforehand so we wouldn't do a terrorist attack on their mailroom. The idea was nothing that's really dangerous and not to shock anybody. And then they freaked out and got their chainsaws out and violated all their procedures on how they deal with anything and just cut the things down.
And I was out here when they were cutting them down, standing at the banks of the river going, why are they doing this? Telling them, why are you doing this? And they said, it's done. The order's been given and they'll be cut and that's it. We said, why didn't you put some fences around it? Because their argument was that the beavers were eating the mulberries and therefore they had to catch all the beavers and kill them. And we said, well, why don't you just fence them off, put some of that stuff over the trees so that we could at least do some testing, see how deep the strontium was that was coming out of there. And they said, no, we'll just cut them down and we'll end that problem.
What it is, maybe Norm can
This
tell
is
you.
Tom Carpenter, Director of Nuclear Programs for the Government Accountability Project. He organized this voyage.
I'm getting tender shoots of mulberry from end springs. I'd understood that it had all been entirely stripped out in 1990, but it appears that it was not, and they seem to have missed some. There's no sense in taking the whole trees out. They tell us what the story is, basically, that DOE probably still has its strontium-90 problem here, and not only is it unable to generally clean up the waste, as is generally known, but they in fact have been ineffectual in destroying the messenger, the mulberries.
Buskey sent the mulberry bushes to a state lab for analysis. Their preliminary findings, 32,000 picocuries of strontium per kilogram, or about 4,000 times drinking water standards. Buskey says that's comparable, or perhaps a little higher, than in 1990. When Broder and Rood were fired for blowing the whistle, they were represented in court by Tom Carpenter and the Government Accountability Project. After lengthy court battles, GAP was able to get them reinstated.
Oh, I see the peak right
and
there.
that one is only, well, I can't see. Give it some time. It's only counted 100 seconds. Give it about 500 seconds.
Here we've been out here trying to get samples and listen to Norm and how he's had to get samples and almost get arrested so many times. And yet somehow, John and I were able to go inside the farms and run a project with, you know, a $10 million project right in the heart of Hanford. You know, John, that didn't come to me till right now. How painful that must have been for Hanford to stand by and let us go into their farms. I mean, they tried to block it every way they could.
The tank farms referred to by Rood are the massive holding tanks used to dispose of millions of gallons of highly radioactive waste created by plutonium production. There are 177 underground tanks containing 54 million gallons of high-level nuclear waste. At least a third of them are now leaking. After they were reinstated, Rood and Broder were able to carry out a number of studies, including this one delivered to the Department of Energy this July, showing the extent of leakage from some of the tanks. The study found that cesium-137, which was not supposed to migrate, had reached depths of 125 feet. The study said, quote, "If cesium-137 has migrated to this depth, where are the major plumes of the other, more mobile radionuclides?" End quote.
What we have back here, these large rocks in here at River Mile 28, are basically where the water from the 200 East area comes into the Columbia River. The river right now is too high to where we can't see it at the shoreline, but when the river drops, we can see where underneath the bank, where we have these streams, and it's a lot of water that is coming in. It basically is about 3 years, somewhere between 1.5 years and 5 years, you get most of the water from 200 East comes into the river, and it's basically, we call them the tritium springs here. You have tritium and cesium-137, cobalt-60, technetium-99, iodine-129, strontium-90, you know, the usual sorts of things that you dump into rivers. And that's when your tanks leak out there, this is where it comes.
In 1962, the radiation in the river was so hot that the Oregon Health Division basically petitioned the Atomic Energy Commission to shut the reactors down on the Columbia River. Radiation was found as far south as the central coast of Oregon, as far north as the central coast of Washington. We're floating down the river now, and right down here by about the Hanford town site, in fact, you can see the tritium plume, which is the purple, and the nitrate plume is basically, this is where most of the nitrate and the tritium come in here. The people in the Tri-Cities drink nitrate, high nitrate concentrations in their water, and they also have tritium in their water. This area here is the worst contaminated site in North America, and I say one of the worst contaminated sites in the world. So there's health concerns. There's health concerns for the indigenous people, of the Native Americans that live on this river. They live here, they swim here, they eat the fish out of here, and they're the ones that have probably the most health risk and have probably suffered the most because of this neglect.
This the Richland City intake for their drinking water. These intakes go up to the water treatment plant.
Broder has seen some indications that radiation levels may be increasing. 3 wells near the river show sharp increases in radiation levels over the past 3 years, and a study of sludge in Richland, the first town downstream from Hanford, shows high levels of radiation.
And what they found was that the sludge creates a perfect reducing environment, and they found significantly higher levels of radionuclides. Principally, I believe it was strontium and cesium in the sludge as compared to other cities in that.
The most dramatic thing was having N-reactor down so that Hanford is not producing plutonium. And that is the best investment America could make, is to stop making that mistake. And that's a huge difference, you know. It's just that the bad news has ended there. As far as the cleanup, what can be seen from the river is it's, you know, not going too well too quickly. And that could use some attention and probably some new management. And it really needs looking at the facts. One still sees the same thing we saw a dozen years ago, which is they aren't really looking at the reality. They're into, you know, shuffling the numbers and the money around rather than the reality.
In June 1999, Buskey discovered that strontium-90 had leaked into the salmon breeding grounds in the Columbia River. It made headline news, and newspaper editorials called for action. 50 years of plutonium production at the Hanford site has resulted in the worst environmental problem in the country. Even a quick survey trip down the river has revealed measurable levels of contamination. But the worst may be yet to come. The public is dependent upon watchdogs like Norm Buskey and the Government Accountability Project, and whistleblowers like Casey Rood and John Broder. We will continue to monitor the river and help develop plans for an alternative to the mismanagement at Hanford. We hope to inspire a new regime at Hanford that truly works for an effective and timely cleanup.